Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, taking a look at some sneaky teams in the SEC heading into 2024. We are at that point in the offseason where you kind of start to finalize how you feel about these programs heading into 2024. The three teams that we are going to talk about, South Carolina, Kentucky, Auburn, these aren't teams that I'm necessarily picking to go out and win the SEC in 2024, but teams that I think can be much better than many people think heading into 2024. Want to dive into a few of these teams, talk about the reasons I'm believing in them heading into the 2024 year. Fired up to get into it. Before we do, and as always, would love to hear from you guys, right? We get plenty of talk about Georgia, Alabama, and Texas. What are some of those teams that you guys are believing in this SEC conference heading into 2024? If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. The amount of support y'all have shown the fellas over the last couple of weeks, it really does mean a lot. Appreciate you guys. And without further ado, let's start with this South Carolina Gamecocks program, where I think where I want to start with South Carolina is a lot of people look at that 2023 season and assume that this South Carolina team had a lot of problems. I look at South Carolina in 2023 and say they had one ginormous problem. And I think this South Carolina team was a much more complete team than a lot of people gave them credit for. And it's on the offensive line. When you go back to 2023, South Carolina was dead last in the SEC in rushing yards per attempt. They were one of the worst pass protecting units in the conference. Look, South Carolina fans, SEC fans know that it is very hard to win a lot of football games in that conference when you cannot pass protect and not run the football. When you struggle on the offensive line, you're going to struggle to win football games. Now, I think that took away from a lot of other positive aspects within this South Carolina team, which gets us to the point of why am I a believer in South Carolina heading into 2024? And I think it starts with an offensive line that I think is going to be massively improved from the 2023 season. You go back to South Carolina in 2023, they were forced to start two true freshmen along the line of scrimmage, both of which were not even enrolled for spring practice. I mean, they essentially had these 18-year-old kids show up on campus in June and say, hey, in 2 months, you have to go block some of the better defensive linemen we see in the country as 18-year-old kids. And it was a problem. I don't think there's any way of sugarcoating that. I mean, what does Shane Beamer do heading into 2024? One, he goes to the transfer portal and grabs a lot of veteran talent, not necessarily the guys that were highlighting at the top of the transfer portal, but a lot of quality depth within this offensive line. But I think more importantly, why you believe in this South Carolina offensive line is a lot of that young talent that was forced to play early in 2023. They're going to be better for it in 2024. You look at a guy like Tree, or you look at a guy like Trevon Baugh, they're going to be better players because they were thrown into the fire during the 2023 season. I look at the South Carolina offensive line. I read some of the spring notes that we see from the South program and say, there are people around this program that feel as if South Carolina's offensive line might be a strength heading into 2024. And if that's the case, I mean, I am a believer in the South Carolina team, but I just need this South Carolina offensive line not to be a liability in 2024 like it was in 2023. If you can run the football a little bit more effectively, create better pass protection, this team wins a lot more football games in 2023 than they did. Now, I think the second reason to believe in South Carolina is they have a quarterback in Lenore Sellers that, look, everybody knows his name if you're a South Carolina fan. If you're not a South Carolina fan, you're just a casual college football fan that roots for another team. You might not even have heard of Lenore Sellers. This kid was an under-recruited kid coming out of high school. Shane Beamer saw him and kind of thought, hey, we want to go bet on that kid. And if he does reach that upside, you have a quarterback that's really, really talented. And from what you hear from South Carolina within spring practice and going into fall camp, it sounds like the second-year quarterback, Lenore Sellers, is starting to put it together. He's got a big body. He's got a massive arm. He's a phenomenal athlete. This kid, from a physical trait standpoint, checks every single box that you want in an elite starting quarterback in the SEC. Now, we got to see him put it together in 2024, but my kind of thinking around South Carolina is if Lenore Sellers puts it together, and this is going to be a really dangerous team in 2024. And then you look at the pass catchers. I think a lot of people look on the surface and say, all right, there's no way this pass catcher unit gets better after losing a first-round NFL draft pick like Xavier Legette. I would argue that this pass catcher room might be better because you have more bodies that are capable in 2024. When you go back to 2023, if Xavier Legette was not catching the football, there was not a lot of explosive plays happening with that pass catcher unit. It was a one-trick pony show with Xavier Legette in the 2023 season. You look at this team and this roster and this pass catcher room in 2024 and say, we got a lot of different guys that can do a lot of different things, but most importantly, a lot more capable bodies, right? You look at some guys like Gage coming in from Miami of Ohio, Jared Brown from Coastal Carolina. You look at Nick Harbor going into his second year. We all knew Nick Harbor was going to be a year 2, year 3 guy. This kid is one of the most talented pass catchers in the country, but we knew it would take a year. He's blazing fast. He's got a big body. Another guy that's really standing out for this South Carolina pass catcher room is Vandarius Jones, who's transferred in from Florida State. Now look at this Florida State pass catcher room and say, or South Carolina pass catcher room, and say, all right, you don't have Xavier Legette, but you got a lot of other options that we think can make some plays for South Carolina. And when you are a little bit more diverse in your pass catcher room, it gets a lot more difficult for defensive coordinators to scheme up against you versus when you just have one really good weapon. All right, that weapon might be awesome, but if that defense can put a safety over top of Xavier Legette, kind of neutralize him, there just wasn't many other ways that South Carolina could manufacture those explosive plays. Side note, it sounds like Rocket Sanders looks back to form, which is going to help this South Carolina rushing attack, which I think can be a really good unit in 2024. When you look at Lenore Sellers, Rocket Sanders, those are some big bodies in the backfield for South Carolina to get creative in terms of how they want this rushing attack to look. You go to the defense, and a really underrated unit last year. Again, I think a lot of the emphasis, and I think a lot of people just assume that this defense wasn't very good. I think they've made significant improvements specifically in that front seven. You look at the South Carolina defensive line, it's probably a top half unit in the SEC. And Alex Huntley, Tonka Hemingway, TJ Sanders, who I think could be a top 100 NFL draft pick. You look at the edge, say Gilbert Edmond, Kyle Kennard, guys that have played a lot of football. Gilbert Edmond played really good for South Carolina in 2022, went to 2023 at Florida State, didn't play as good. Now look at the South Carolina team and say, I think they got better at the spots they needed to heading into 2024. I'm not picking them to win the SEC. This team can be dangerous if some of the things fall into the right place heading into 2024. Want to take a look at this Kentucky program as well, which you look at Kentucky, I think you got to start with quarterback Brock Vandagriff. The knock on Brock Vandagriff is he hasn't played any football yet going into year 4. I think what's interesting about Brock Vandagriff is although he hasn't played a ton of college football at Georgia, he played a lot of football at the high school level and was extremely productive. So I think on paper at the college level, this kid hasn't played a ton of quarterback, but you go back to high school, 4-year starter, threw for over 10,000 yards at the high school level. That experience might be able to help Brock Vandagriff, kind of hit the ground running in Lexington, Kentucky. And I think Brock Vandagriff, from a physical trait standpoint, I think he's going to be better than Devin Leary, who came in and, for lack of better terms, just struggled, especially against that top talent in the SEC. Devin Leary was not the quarterback a lot of us thought was going to be for Kentucky in the 2023 season. I think next you look at Kentucky and say they have legitimate NFL talent all over the football field. You look at the wide receiver spot, Jamori Macklin coming from North Texas, Barry Brown, one of the most explosive playmakers that you see in the country. And then you look at Dan Key, probably the best wide receiver in the room. Those 3 wide receivers make up what I think is a top 5 pass catcher room that you see in the SEC. And I think the offensive line is finally getting back to what we expect Kentucky's offensive line to look like. I think this offensive line is probably a top half unit in the SEC as well. And so if Brock Vandagriff puts it together in the 2024 season, he has the pass catchers to make it happen. I think he's going to have the run game and pass protection to make it happen as well. This Kentucky offense can take a lot of people by surprise. And then you look at the defensive side of the football and say NFL talent at all 3 levels. Or you look at the defensive line, it obviously starts with Deion Walker, one of, if not the best, interior defensive lineman that we'll see in the country. You look at a guy like J.J. Weaver coming back, probably could have been on an NFL roster had he chosen to declare to the NFL draft. You look at the linebacker room, obviously headlined by Georgia transfer Jamon Dumas-Johnson, but Derek Jackson is also a really good football player. Two guys that I think will be playing in the NFL. And then you go to the secondary, say Maxwell Harrison, one of the best cornerbacks in the country. And you look at a guy like Zion Childress, one of the better safeties in the country. I look at Kentucky's defense. I trust Mark Stoops to get the most out of this defense and say, hey, we got NFL talent at all three levels of this defensive side of the football. If things fall in the right places for this Kentucky team, specifically at the quarterback spot with Brock Vandagriff, I think this team can be really dangerous in the 2024 season. My last team I want to shout out, the Auburn Tigers. Now, does this qualify as a sneaky team? I don't know, because a lot of people are talking about this Auburn program. What really fascinates me about this Auburn program, specifically on offense, again, they get better at the spots they needed to get better at. I think this offensive line improves with Percy Lewis coming in at left tackle. Now you can kick Dylan Wade to that left guard spot. Dylan Wade was a very good left tackle for Auburn last year, but we all know he's better suited at guard. I think Connor Lew is a stud at the center position. I think this offensive line, again, probably a top half unit in the SEC. Then you look at Peyton Thorne. That's the big question mark. Can Peyton Thorne put it together in 2024? It was sloppy. It was rough in 2023. Here's the reason, at least in my opinion, to believe in Peyton Thorne. One, Peyton Thorne last year came in late in the summer. It was kind of battling out for that starting quarterback job heading into 2023. He ends up winning the job, but just didn't have any talent around him. I think this wide receiver room for Auburn is significantly better than what we saw last year, obviously headlined by true freshman Cam Coleman, but they bring in Keandre Lambert-Smith, who was one of the better wide receivers that we saw in the Big Ten last year. So you get Peyton Thorne a whole nother year in this Auburn offense during the offseason. We have a quality offensive line with a really good running back in Jarquez Hunter, with elite wide receivers at the boundary. I mean, I think there are a lot of wins at the sail for this Auburn program that are pushing Auburn to be much better on the offensive side of the football. And it all culminates with what we're hearing is Hugh Freeze is going to have a heavier hand in terms of running this Auburn offense, which I think is a massive storyline. You look at why Hugh Freeze was brought into this Auburn program. It was, one, to get the talent right, which you are seeing slowly come together. But more importantly, and Hugh Freeze is one of the better offensive play callers and offensive minds that we see in all of college football. Hugh Freeze taking back control of this offense, I think, is a storyline that not enough people are talking about. And then you go to the defensive side of the football and say, there's a lot of young talent on this team that I think can be really, really good. I think Keldrick Falk has a very good chance of emerging as one of the better edge rushers that we see in the SEC. Jalen McLeod, the transfer from App State last year, was probably the best pass rusher for Auburn last year. You have a lot of depth on the inside of the defensive line. I think the question is, how good can that unit be? And then at the off-ball linebacker spot, you got two redshirt seniors that have played a lot of football together. You kind of feel good about that. And then you got some young talent in the secondary. I look at this Auburn team and say it is significantly more complete than it was last year. They identified the weaknesses that they had with this program in 2023, went aggressively and kind of made those weaknesses. And some points, that wide receiver position was probably the worst room in that Auburn team. It's probably one of the better units that you see on this Auburn roster heading into 2024. Auburn got better at a lot of different spots. And again, I don't think this team's going to compete for an SEC championship in the 2024 season. But you look at 2025 and 2026, we've said it all off season long. That is when this Auburn team can really put it together and be a dangerous team in the SEC. But I think they get significantly better heading into 2024. We'll cut it there. South Carolina, Kentucky, Auburn, teams that maybe are not on everybody's radar heading into 2024 in the SEC, but teams that I think can be sneaky good and got a lot better heading into 2024. Would love to hear some programs that I might be sleeping on heading into 2024. I learned a ton from you guys in the comments section. Appreciate y'all rocking with it. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.